Most Americans have never heard of it. And that's exactly what makes this story one of the most extraordinary untold chapters in muscle car history. While Ford and Chevrolet and Dodge were fighting their legendary wars on American streets and racetracks in the early 1970s, while the Boss 429 and the Chevelle SS and the Plymouth Roadrunner were making headlines, across the United States, something remarkable was happening on the other side of the world. In a country most Americans associated with kangaroos and the outback, engineers were quietly building a muscle car so advanced, so powerful, and so distinctly different from anything Detroit had ever produced that when American automotive journalists finally discovered it years later, they struggled to explain how it had existed without their knowledge. The car was the Chrysler Valiant Charger, built not in Detroit, not in Michigan, not anywhere in the United States. Built in Australia in 1971 by Chrysler engineers who had been told to create the greatest performance car their country had ever seen. And they succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. This is the true story of the car that America forgot, and Australia never will. To understand how the Chrysler Valiant Charger came to exist, you need to understand something about Australia in the late 1960s that most Americans don't know. Australia had its own muscle car war, not an imitation of the American muscle car wars, not a pale reflection of what was happening in Detroit. A genuine, fierce, passionate automotive rivalry that was uniquely Australian, fought on Australian roads, at Australian racetracks, and in the hearts and minds of Australian car buyers who were every bit as passionate about performance as their American counterparts. The two combatants in this war were Ford Australia and General Motors Holden. Ford had the Falcon. Holden had the Tirana and the Kingswood. And for years, these two companies had dominated Australian motoring, the way Ford and Chevrolet dominated America. Chrysler Australia was the underdog, the third player, the company that was always competitive but never quite dominant. And in 1970, Chrysler Australia's engineers decided that was going to change. The project was called the E38, and what those engineers designed, working in relative isolation from Detroit, with their own ideas and their own understanding of what Australian drivers wanted, was unlike anything Chrysler had ever built in America. The Chrysler Valiant Charger launched in 1971, and the moment Australians saw it, they understood something extraordinary had arrived. The body was stunning, genuinely, independently stunning, not derivative of American design, not a copy of anything Detroit was producing. The Charger featured a fastback roofline so dramatic and so perfectly proportioned that it would later be voted the most beautiful Australian car ever designed in multiple industry polls. Wide rear haunches, a sweeping roofline, a front end that was aggressive without being cartoonish. Australian motoring journalists who had spent years covering American muscle cars flew to the launch and came away shaking their heads, not because the car was trying to be American, but because it wasn't. The Chrysler Valiant Charger looked like Australia, bold and distinctive and completely confident in its own identity. But the body was just the beginning. Let's talk about what Chrysler Australia put under that hood, because this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. The base Charger came with a 245 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine, and before you stop listening, understand that this was not an ordinary 6-cylinder. This was a Hemi 6. A genuine hemispherical combustion chamber 6-cylinder engine that Chrysler Australia had developed independently and that produced power figures that embarrassed many American V8s of the same era. Chrysler offered the Valiant Charger in multiple states of tune. The standard 245 Hemi 6 produced 185 horsepower. The upgraded version produced 215 horsepower. And then there was the engine that made the automotive world pay attention. The E49 option. The E49 was a 265 cubic inch version of the Hemi 6, breathing through 3 Weber carburetors, a feature more commonly associated with Italian exotic cars than Australian muscle. The 3 Webers sat on a cross-ram intake manifold. The cylinder head was modified with larger valves and improved porting. The compression ratio was raised aggressively. Official power output, 302 horsepower, from a 6-cylinder engine in 1971. To put that in perspective, a standard 1,971 Chevrolet Camaro SS with the 350 cubic inch V8 was officially rated at 270 horsepower. The Chrysler Valiant Charger E49, with 2 fewer cylinders and significantly less displacement, produced more power. And the E49 Charger didn't just make power on paper. It delivered that power with a ferocity and a character that contemporary Australian road testers described as unlike anything they had ever experienced in a locally built car. Motor Manual Australia tested an E49 Charger in 1972 and recorded a quarter-mile time of 14.9 seconds on street tires with standard road equipment, against American muscle cars that were already being strangled by emissions regulations and compression ratio reductions. But here is the fact that stopped American journalists cold when they finally discovered it. The Chrysler Valiant Charger E49 was factory homologated for Australian touring car racing, and on the racetrack it was devastatingly, embarrassingly fast. In the 1972 Bathurst 1000, Australia's most important and most prestigious motor race, held on the brutally demanding Mount Panorama circuit in New South Wales, the Chrysler Valiant Charger dominated in a way that redefined what was possible for a production-based race car. The Charger of Peter Brock, yes, that Peter Brock, the man who would become the most celebrated racing driver in Australian history, qualified on the front row. The Chargers were faster through the sweeping, high-speed corners of Mount Panorama than anything Ford or Holden could put on the grid. They didn't win that year. Mechanical problems intervened, but what they demonstrated in qualifying and in the early stages of the race was enough. The Chrysler Valiant Charger had announced itself as a genuine racing machine, not a street car pretending to be a racer, but a fundamentally serious performance vehicle that happened to be road legal. Now, here is the detail that most people, even serious Australian classic car enthusiasts, don't fully appreciate. The Chrysler Valiant Charger was developed with almost complete independence from Detroit. American Chrysler executives were aware of the project. They approved the investment, but the engineering decisions, the choice of the Hemi 6 over a V8, the 3-carburetor setup, the specific suspension tuning for Australian roads, those were made in Australia by Australian engineers who understood their market in ways that Detroit never could. This independence is what made the Charger unique. It wasn't a rebadged American car. It wasn't Detroit's idea of what Australians wanted. It was a genuinely original creation, a muscle car designed by Australians for Australians that happened to be built under the Chrysler name. And that independence showed in every detail. The suspension was tuned specifically for Australian road conditions, rougher, more demanding, less forgiving than the American highways the big Detroit muscle cars were designed for. The steering was sharper and more communicative than comparable American cars. The Charger handled in a way that genuinely surprised American drivers who encountered it more European in its responses than anything coming out of Detroit in the early 1970s. The interior reflected Australian practicality, well-designed, functional, without the excessive ornamentation that characterized many American cars of the same era. Australians wanted to drive their cars, not display them. But the story of the Chrysler Valiant Charger is not entirely a triumphant one, and the reasons it ended are as instructive as the reasons it existed. The same forces that killed American muscle cars killed the Australian Charger.